Good afternoon. Thanks for the introduction and thank you for the invitation to be part of this series. Can you please confirm that you can see well the slide?
Yep, you're coming through well.
Sounds good. Sounds good. Okay, so before starting the presentation, I just want to introduce myself and provide a brief background. I'm originally from Brazil, where I completed my degree in animal science before moving to US. And then in 2009, I moved actually to Madison, Wisconsin. And I had 1 year internship and then a master's and PhD in the Department of Dairy Science. In September of 2015, I moved to upstate New York, to Chazy, New York, for a brief postdoc at the Miner Institute. And in February of 2016, I moved to Gainesville, Florida, which was a drastic change in terms of weather and a couple other things. But I spent 4 years at University of Florida as an assistant professor of livestock nutrition. And at the end of last year, when they opened the ruminant nutrition extension specialist, I I couldn't really pass this great opportunity to be back to Wisconsin and join first the department that gave me so many opportunities, but also UW Extension, which is well known in the entire country as an outstanding outstanding extension provider. So today, I think the topic that was requested for us was to talk a little bit of how to feed the 2020 corn silage crop. And I think it's a great topic because corn silage is one of the main areas of research that we have been working on. And basically what we will try to do today is first take a look in a couple numbers and evaluate, okay, so how was the corn silage 2020 crop? And based on those numbers, we'll try to discuss a little bit what are the known and hidden effects of this year's harvesting conditions. I won't lie to you. I won't show all the hidden effects. Every year, the corn silage crop proved me wrong several times. So I won't try to predict everything that may happen this upcoming year before we reach the next silage season, but we will try to understand a little bit of that and hopefully highlight some instances of interest that you should still be paying attention in order to make sure some of those hidden facts do not create any issues. So before discussing some numbers, the reason why we care so much about why the corn silage crop will matter a lot for us this upcoming year is if you think about a dairy cow, on average, a lactating dairy cow will consume approximately 55 pounds of dry matter. And if you think about those 55 pounds of dry matter, very often we see diets where corn silage represents close to 40, sometimes 50% of the diet. Okay, I know that here in Wisconsin, a lot of people still feed a lot of alfalfa, so some of the corn silage numbers are diluted to a certain extent, but it still play a major role. And corn silage, because of its nature in terms of very high fiber and very high starch, typically has digestibility coefficient of 62, 65% of the dry matter. And this is important because even though I'm giving you an average, the variation is very high. So we can always expect, regardless of the year, regardless of the herd, that your cows will be ranging plus or minus 15 percentage units in digestibility, right? And the crop plays a major role in that. So if you have a crop that perhaps is not so digestible, this may affect drastically the overall production of the system. So we try to put that into a rule of thumb of for every 1 pound of TDN that your diet offers, 3.5 pounds of milk very likely will be generated from this energy available. Okay? So the question is, what is the true potential for the 2020 corn silage. And in order to do that, we will have to summarize a couple of different nutrients. So here we have just a simple representation of all the different nutrients that contribute to TDN, which is, in my opinion, the number that we want to take a look overall for the corn silage season. But you'll see that primarily corn silage is dependent upon NDF and starch. So basically 75% of that value will be correlated to starch and fiber digestibility. So those are the two main numbers that we will look in contrast with previous years and try to understand what's going on with those numbers in 2020. But before going through some of those numbers, I think it's important to mention that even though 2020 was a much better year in terms of silage production compared to 2019, for example, which we know that was a little bit more complex for many dairies, it still brought some challenge, right? And one of those challenges was certain areas had a lot of drought stress corn. And this is of particular importance because when we have drought stress corn, a couple of things that we have to pay attention include how variable is our crop, right? If you go to the field during periods where you know that your corn is stressed by a drought, you can see that the variation in plants throughout that field is greater than usual, right? So because of that, it kind of creates some challenge on how to properly or how to establish the harvesting date for corn silage. In addition to that, if the weather is too dry for too long, there is potential for more ash contamination. Sometimes some of this ash brings, they are basically related to more soil contamination, which may bring some other yeast and molds and consequently lead to the production of other undesired metabolites. An example of those would be mycotoxins. And in addition to that, we know that every time we have a drought year, there's a lot of discussion about nitrate, right? Some of the corn plants may accumulate more nitrate because of the drought. And if you have very high nitrate in your silo, this may be an issue not only for your cows, but also for people that work with that silo because it may be toxic, right? So it's another thing to pay attention. Another interesting thing, and now it's a good thing, at least we think it would be like that. In 2020, a lot of the predictions I had opportunity to go through was that yields would be much greater than previous years. So a lot of the discussion about the 2020 corn silage was, okay, so is it time to accumulate more inventory? Or because I will have more inventory due to those greater yields, should I start thinking about different harvesting strategies and perhaps using some high chop, which typically lead to greater nutritive value in terms of greater starch and greater fiber digestibility? So did that really happen? What those samples look like this time and so on, right? And the last thing, and we are not going to discuss that today, I just wanted to point out because I think was one of the most complex scenarios that we saw this year in terms of corn production was a lot of down corn in Iowa particularly. We just put together a brief extension fact sheet, should be published in the Dairy Extension website hopefully soon. So for those of you that have interest, seeing a little bit of the impacts of down corn or how to handle down corn could be a good material to read. But we're not going to be discussing that, but I can answer any questions if you have. Okay? So before continuing with the data, I just want to acknowledge John Gazer and Rock River Labs for providing the data set we are using today for this presentation. And basically in this first table, we have the median values for several different ingredients just to have an idea of what's going on. And then we will try to depict some of those nutrients in a more broad fashion. So this way we can understand if the average represents really what's going on, or if there's a lot of variation and so on, okay? But if we pay attention to this particular numbers, if you go through that, it's very easy to consider that, yeah, the 2020 corn silage looks very good, right? On average, 35% dry matter. Starch is close to 33%, so it's not a bad number. Maybe a little bit shorter on starch than previous years, but still very good. Then TT and DFD or in vitro and DFD 30 are reasonable numbers as well. So the first impression we have about the 2020 corn silage is that it looks like a very good crop, okay? So let's try to compare and contrast that a little bit with some of previous years in different ways, okay? So first, this is a very simple comparison. The only reason why we are showing those few parameters here is because we use those in a similar presentation during the spring semester. And if you go through NDF, you will see that 2020 brought a little bit more NDF, okay? And part of that may be associated perhaps with taller plants, which could explain some of the greater yields, okay? And obviously all the time you have more NDF in corn silage, this matches very well with lower starch, okay? And of course the opposite would be true as well, okay? Answering the question I add about, well, ash contamination because of drought, if you go through the median numbers, ash was exactly the same as 2019. So in theory, we shouldn't be worried about that, right? But is this really true? And then as we look at in situ starch digestibility at 7 hours, numbers also are very, very similar to previous years. So that indicates that this may be a very good crop, right? But you can also see that fiber digestibility is greater. And I think that's a great thing to see because during the harvesting season, because of growing degree days, a lot of people were expecting greater lignification of corn plants and consequently a less digestible material. So at first we can see here that this didn't really happen based on the TT and DFD data. So if we just contrast these 3 years, in theory, we have exactly the same potential on paper, right? But let's try to dig a little bit further. So this is a table summarize some of the fiber quality metrics that we typically use to understand corn silage. And we highlighted here the parameter of interest. Basically, these numbers were put together by Dr. Shaver some years ago. Okay, the only numbers I added to this table would be the last column here or the 2020 column. And if you go through those numbers, you see that we have the normal range, okay, it's not the total distribution of samples, but it has the normal range in the United States. The only thing I want to ask you to be a little bit careful with this comparison here is that the normal range is based on 4 commercial laboratories, and the 2020 is based on a single commercial laboratory data. So sometimes because of methods differ among those labs, we may have a slightly different values. So be a little bit careful with that, but you can see that all the numbers here, with maybe the exception is lignin, are within the normal range. Okay, and even lignin being a little bit above the normal range, I wouldn't worry too much because you can see that the NDFD 30 as well as the TT NDFD, they are probably closer to the upper level of the normal range compared to the lower level. So I don't think it's really a struggle here, okay? In addition to that, here we have some indication of what we want to happen with some of those factors in order to improve quality of corn silage, right? So briefly, we want to have a little bit less NDF, less lignin, and less UNDF. If you're not familiar with UNDF, basically this is a relatively new assay where we incubate samples in rumen fluid for 240 hours. And basically the residue is the undigestible portion of the NDF. Basically, you can say that that's the portion of fiber that cannot be digested in the rumen of a dairy cow. Okay, I think this would be a fair conclusion to those numbers. So regardless if you use lignin or UNDF, you want those numbers to decrease, and consequently, if you're able to achieve that, your digestibility, either in vitro here or those predictions from the TT-NDFD assay, we want them to go up. So let's try to understand a little bit what's going on in comparison with previous years. So you'll see several plots exactly like this first one here. I'll just briefly introduce the plot or the graph, so this way you can have a full understanding of what we are presenting today. So you see here in the x-axis, it's going to be presented the percentage of the specific parameter of the slide. In this particular case is NDF as a percentage of dry matter. And then on the y-axis here, we have highlighted different years. Okay? Then if you go through those curves for each year, you're gonna see 3 bars, okay? The bar of interest for us at first is the middle bar, okay? That's the median number, okay? That's the number that we will assume is close to the average for this particular exercise. And I think it's important to see that for each of those graphs, we added a red bar or a red line here based on the 2020 median to see how it compares with previous years, okay? And you see that some of those numbers may slightly differ from the first 2 tables that we presented when either introducing the 2020 crop or when contrasting that with the 2019 and 2018 crops, okay? But if we pay attention to NDF, overall, NDF was very close to last year's crop in terms of the median. It was slightly higher than 2018, 17, and 16, but it didn't differ much, right? But I think it's important to notice that all the time we have more NDF, we have to be a little bit cautious on how to formulate diet because fiber typically is less digestible than starch, so it does affect intake. But if we move towards UNDF values, which basically is the non-digestible portion of the NDF, if you will, you can see that the median is slightly lower than the last 3 to 4 years. And I think this gives us a very good indication that, you know, even though we have more NDF in those forages, perhaps this material is more digestible. So the greater levels of NDF will not likely to compromise any sort of intake. And I believe that the in vitro NDFD 30 numbers, which basically give us an idea on how fast this NDF can be digested, it kind of match with the UNDF values as expected, right? And interesting is that, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, even though lignin was predicted to be higher this year, doesn't look like is the case. So I always have the question, but what may be going on, right? Why digestibility is greater? And this is just another representation of digestibility is the TT and DFD. And again, we see slightly greater digestibility values than previous year. Well, but why fiber digestibility looks better in 2020 if some of the predictions were that it would be less digestible? And that's a question that I cannot answer with 100% of confidence. Okay, I do think there is a couple of different reasons of why this is going on. And just to elucidate a little bit what was going on is, first, for many places throughout the state, we had some drought stress corn. Okay? Well, if you think about that, there is, I'm gonna say belief, okay, but I don't think is the correct word here, that in years where we have drought stress corn, digestibility is better for fiber digestibility, okay? And a lot of people believes into that and discuss as such, but I was digging into literature to try to better understand those factors, and there are not a lot of trials with corn. And the few trials available with corn suggest that this is not necessarily true. You know, when you have control studies controlling the water, either through irrigation or if you use some of the greenhouses to run some of those trials, which then is very, very controlled, you don't see those changes in digestibility like we see in the field. So this leads to two different concepts. Okay, the first concept is perhaps there is greater variation in the field. So sometimes what we see, a lot of brownish plants, we have the expectation that the material is very dry. And it's not necessarily the case. Okay, so a lot of times we harvest drought stress corn thinking that will be very, very dry. And in reality, the dry matter is lower than usual for the visual. So this could be one of the reasons, right? Because of that, people try to target the harvest window earlier, and consequently you reduce a little bit of maturity. Maturity is correlated with lignin accumulation and consequently fiber digestibility. Okay? The other factor that may be affecting those numbers in 2020 is because of the anticipated greater yields, a lot of discussion on increasing cutting height occur. And I'm going to show some data about cutting height, but if you increase the shop height or cutting height, you improve fiber digestibility. So perhaps we are seeing a confounded factor here that leads to to a certain extent well accepted fact that drought stress corn has higher fiber digestibility. So this could be another option. Okay? But if we dig into the dry matter numbers at first, you will see that dry matter was slightly higher than in 2019. So my first theory about drought stress corn maybe was harvested earlier than usual is not necessarily true. Okay? Actually, if you pay attention to that, you see that the curve for the 2020 crop actually lasts a little bit longer than some of the other years. So there is a reasonable amount of drier silage that enter silos this year. So, you know, it goes kind of backwards to what we would think. So that leaves the high cut material, which could be the case as if you think about high cut or high chop, basically, if you pay attention to the first two pictures here, all the time you increase your height of cut, basically what you're doing is you're leaving a greater portion of the stalk. And if you think about the corn plant, lignin and consequently the less digestible portion of the fiber stays in the field because that's where their highest concentration is. And just to highlight some of those numbers for you, this is an average of several studies conducted throughout US. And as you increase from 7 to 21 inches, you see a decrease in NDF, which goes against what we saw for the 2020 silage, but we see some benefits on NDF digestibility. Okay? Another thing that goes slightly against this theory is that starch typically goes up, and we saw starch going down in 2020. Okay? But just to give you an idea, for those of you that really use this technique or management practice, here is just a summary of literature, and that's what our expected response is for each 10 inches of increase in shop height. And basically, dry matter goes up a little bit, with which I think it's fair to assume it happened this year. NDF goes down, which does not align with what we see. Lignin goes down as well, which fits what we saw in terms of lignin or UNDF. And in vitro NDFD goes up, which we saw as well. Okay? So regardless of what happened with the 2020 corn silage, I think it's important to highlight that because UNDF and lignin went down and digestibility values went up, I think the practical implication for this crop is that it's more unlikely to have intake limitation if you increase a little bit corn silage in the diet. And I think this is important because, and I'm not really sure what is the strategy that people will try to apply from now on in terms of trying to increase milk production, or if the best option is to try to maintain milk production and limit diet prices. But perhaps the establishment of high forage diets allow you to reduce a little bit the cost of the diet. And if you have very good quality forage, like the 2020 corn silage looks like, it allows you to do that. And this typically is increase efficiency and consequently income over feed cost. So perhaps there is opportunities this year to establish a little bit higher forage diets without any issues because the digestibility values are good. Okay? And just to illustrate that, we expect that for every percentage unit increase in NDF digestibility in vitro, we should expect a little bit greater intake, a little bit greater fat-corrected milk. And this is also true for diets where we include more than 40% corn silage. And another benefit of that, and I'm not going to go through in deep with this slide, is that perhaps this year is a good year for the cows as well, because usually when we have higher fiber digestibility, cows will consume more. And basically this slide is presented backwards, okay? Basically this slide shows trials that compare silage of different digestibility values. Data is presented as percentage that the cows consuming the low digestibility diet response was compared to the high digestibility diets. So basically in the first trial here, cows consuming low digestible forage had 88% of the intake of cows consuming very high digestible forages. So basically what we can expect is that if you feed low digestibility diets in terms of fiber, cows will have between 5 and 15% lower intake, and they will spend 5 to 20% more time in the feed bunk. So because corn silage looks much better in 2020 from a fiber digestibility perspective, perhaps intakes will be good and animals will consume for a smaller period of time and perhaps spend more time resting, ruminating, and so on. So, but now changing a little bit from fiber to starch. Basically, again, we have here the parameter of interest. A simple error indicating what we want to do with those parameters in corn silage, and then what the values were for 2020. Basically, in terms of starch, and I'm very biased, I really like trying to improve starch in corn silage is one of our main goals. So you'll see that we have a lot of arrows pointing up here, but at the end of the day, more starch or more digestible starch is highlighted here by the in situ starch D7 hours or greater corn silage processing score, which also translates into greater digestibility. Those will all enhance the energy levels of your silage and consequently allow for greater milk yields. Okay? So just to provide a similar summary to what we saw with fiber, for starch concentration, you see the values are slightly lower for starch than 2018, 2017, and 2016, probably 2 to 3 percentage units maximum. But when we compare parameters of starch digestibility, and here we have the 0 hour or soluble fraction, followed by the 7 hours, you will see that the 2020 corn silage looks very promising in terms of starch digestibility. So I think we have a crop where we have two of the main nutrients more digestible than usual, we can say, which allow us to manipulate diets in different ways. And I think it fits very well with the idea of establishing higher forage diets if inventory allows you to, because this way you have first more digestible fiber, but also you have more digestible starch, and perhaps you can save some room in the diet by removing maybe some of the corn and adding some cheaper byproducts, for example. So this is another strategy that this corn silage may allow you to do so. So just summarizing the starch quality indicators, basically, if you change some of those indicators, basically will be increasing the energy density of the diet. And different than fiber digestibility, I think the main impact that we have with starch is either a benefit directly on milk production, or sometimes animals will not produce more, but they may eat a little bit less. So you may have some benefits on feed efficiency. And I believe this year we may have a good case for that. Okay? So going back to our case scenarios, let's dig a little bit further into the drought stress corn, and we put some question marks here about moisture and dry matter range, ash contamination, nitrate, and some other metabolites. I believe we answered the question about dry matter some slides ago. So I think the median values were similar to previous years, maybe a little bit drier, particularly if you look to the high end of the curve or the drier end of the curve. So perhaps indicates a greater field variation. I'm not sure about that, but very likely is what's going on. So the question, I guess, is what happens with the other parameters? And if we go through about ash contamination, if you recall our initial slides, we had 4.3% ash in 2018, 4.4 in 2019, and 4.4 in 2020, right? This graph here shows a slight different number. So you can see that the median values here for ash are a little bit higher than previous years, okay? But I think the main issue I see with this slide is the high-end values of ash for 2020. You can see that the curve here goes a little bit longer than usual for 2020 than previous years. And this may be an indication of slightly greater soil contamination in silage. Okay, we cannot be 100% sure on that, but perhaps because of the drought, this could be something to pay attention to in future months, just to make sure silage is still good and there are no issues with that. So basically, there is this indication of slightly higher contamination. Then the other question we typically have about drought stress corn is nitrate. Unfortunately, the sample set we got was kind of small for nitrate, but the numbers for nitrate are much, much lower than the typically observed, than the typically recommended maximum for cattle. So if we take this small sample set as true, very likely there is not many issues with nitrate this year, but pay attention when you open silage and so on. So if silage is too yellow, or if there is some reddish type of gases leaving the silo at opening, be careful with that, because there is a high likelihood in those cases that nitrate's there. Okay, and you want to make sure the ppms of nitrates are not beyond 1500. So at least at first, of course, you can dilute that in diets and make sure cows can consume those. Because of the ash contamination issues we highlighted here, we raised the question about other undesired metabolites. And I went through a lot of plots about yeast and molds and some of the mycotoxins that are typically analyzed. And I didn't see any conclusive numbers that this year we have more issues with yeast and molds or more issues with mycotoxins than usual, okay? However, we saw some slightly elevated yeast and mold counts. So I think it will be important for dairies that have high yeast and mold counts to also pay attention to some more complete hygiene analysis, which would include several mycotoxins, just to be safe and make sure this is not an issue that you'll be exposing your animals to.